everyone. It's so good to be here. Oh, I loved hearing that. Let me hear it again.
Hi.
Yay. Hello.
That's about 26, 27 people.
Wonderful. Well, if you wouldn't mind joining me for some deep breaths together, that will help ground me and ground us together across the world. So go ahead and sit in whatever position is most comfortable for you. And either allow your eyes to close or just focus softly in front of you. Allow your shoulders to drop. Take a deep breath in. And release. Now take a slow breath in. And release. Thank you for that moment of grounding. What I wanted to do with y'all was take you a bit through my own story and my own journey, and then share a little bit more about the shadow work that I have done in my own life as a advocate. I won't necessarily say activist. I'm in a conversation with myself about that word and my relationship to it, but definitely an advocate and as a leader over the years. And then I would really love to hear from you and what threads you'd like me to pull a little bit more, because I am an open book and I would love to hear your thoughts. My story starts in Los Angeles. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and something that was going on during the time that I was born in like the early 80s was the gang wars in LA. And it was violent, it was brutal. Something like 15,000 young Black men were killed during that time. So it was like at the level of a civil war down there. And my parents wanted to do something to help. So there were older foster brothers in our home that I grew up with that were both African American and Latino. And that became a group home, that became 2 group homes, that became a foster family agency. So my parents, when I was growing up, would help parents whose children were being taken from them to clean themselves up, get themselves together so that they could be reunited with their children, or they would just support that fostering process and had a bunch of foster parents that they would work with to get them foster children and support them in whatever way that they needed. So one of the ways that I grew up was watching my parents help families. And it just never occurred to me that work wasn't that. So that would be, I think, where my activist path started. I think it would have been different if my parents had normal jobs, you know, were bankers or architects or just something like that. But they weren't. My parents were activists. And so I grew up thinking that that's what work actually was. Speaking of families, I forgot to mention that I have a 2-year-old and an almost 5-year-old, and they are upstairs, and it is bedtime. So if it gets loud, I'm going to do my very best to make sure that you can still hear me. But Cynthia or anybody, just feel free to interrupt me if you need to and say, yeah, we can hear the heavy footsteps upstairs. So grew up watching my parents support other parents, support primarily the African American community. And when I went to college, what I wanted to do was major in Black theater and get a PhD in theater so I could teach folklore, because I saw storytelling as being something very necessary for how I wanted to support just the human story. And there's a whole other thread of my family being embedded in the entertainment industry in Black Hollywood back in the day that I'll go into that if it's interesting for you. But suffice to say, like, the entertainment industry was something that I was familiar with. And I did feel like narratives and storytelling were a big part of my path. But then I was a climate kid during the era of An Inconvenient Truth. When An Inconvenient Truth came out, I believe I was a sophomore in college. I went to see it in movie theaters and was completely blown away and was like, okay, I want to teach Black theater, but we can't do any art or have narratives if we can't breathe and there's no air or water. So I was really activated around the environment, and then spent a lot of time really torn between my identities. Was I a Black woman who was fighting for Black rights? Was I an environmentalist who was fighting for the earth? I didn't see very many people who felt like they were doing both, but in a way that was building something. Most of the people of color that I was around who were into environmental work were doing environmental justice work, which was incredibly beautiful work. And I saw most of it being about stopping bad things from happening. And I was having a lot of trouble finding what was being built. And it just didn't feel the way that a lot of the sustainability work in the early 2000s felt to me. So I was very torn. And then I ended up doing green jobs work because that became kind of the new hype around 2008. Then I ended up moving into food systems when Michelle Obama planted the White House garden, and was in food systems work for about 4 years before going back to climate change. I bounced around food systems and climate change for a while until I had a pretty significant breakdown in 2014. And gosh, what to say about that breakdown? I don't know if you've discussed how dysfunctional the nonprofit executive director position is, just as a job, but it's pretty rough. It can be pretty rough. There's so much. My firm now, Soil and Shadow, we do business coaching. So it's leadership team and organizational development. And looking at the difference between for-profit and nonprofit now has been eye-opening on food systems and education, all the way to supporting local entrepreneurs who were doing businesses and who were living in very edgy circumstances, African American entrepreneurs, just trying to make it work. So also spreading myself between different communities like that, like trying to make sure that my people could be seen by trying to access these high leverage opportunities, but then having to mask myself when I was around people with power, or feel like I was masking myself, having to try to then open back up when I was talking to my folks. It was psychologically and emotionally a lot of code switching that felt very difficult. And then I became the executive director of a national climate organization that had a very large profile. And I was way over my head, just completely in over my head. And I walked into the job burned out, which is not the right thing to do if you're going to be doing that kind of work. And so I found out that year I was going to have fertility issues and have trouble having children. That, in addition to how overwhelmed I was with the work itself, it was just too much. It was too much. And my body and my mind and my heart and my spirit just shut down. And so in 2014, I found myself in a valley, and I had been to very high peaks. So finding myself in that particular valley was disheartening and incredibly uncomfortable. I had a coach, a brilliant executive coach, when I was a nonprofit executive director in 2014, before my breakdown. And the way that she coached me just felt different. Like it felt like there was a spiritual undertone. It's the only way I can think of to say it, underneath her work. And I asked her about it when I left my position and said, it feels like you're doing something that I can't quite identify, but I would really love to know what it is, because it's healing me, like it's helping me. And she said that much of her work came from yoga. And that was when I really started learning about yoga as a lineage beyond the Americanized asana practice that most people register as yoga. And one of the things in that practice was the kleshas and the sources of pain. And looking at that was what helped my coach's late husband develop his shadow work integration process called Pigs Eat Wolves. And I said, okay, I'm trying to learn about that. So she took me through that journey and helped me see my own trying to think of the right word to use, my own accountability in my experience. That yes, I had been put into somewhat insane circumstances as a nonprofit executive director in systems that were inherently flawed, etc. All of that was true. And there was a narrative of power that I could have in it about how my shadow interacted with all of that and made my circumstances worse instead of better. So one thing that I wanted to do with y'all is to walk you through that shadow integration journey a bit and do the step-by-step of how that works and kind of take my own experience through. But before I do that, I just want to pause and see if there's any questions or reflections on my story and what I shared. Not obligated, you don't have to, but this is kind of a swivel and a turning point in the story I'm sharing. So I wanted to give some space.
Thank you, Nikki. That was beautiful. Does anyone have anything for me to chat? I think that was a cliffhanger, and everyone's hanging on the edge, Nikki.
Okay, very good. Awesome. Okay, feel free to back off if you need to. I want to make sure that you can stay with me here.
Okay.
Okay, so shadow integration journey as a story of the three little pigs. Now, one of the things I love about this is that the leader of that firm.
Can you pause a sec, Nikki? Can you all hear behind?
Yes.
You can hear about the three little pigs? Yes, okay. Just checking that the sound is carrying through.
Okay.
Okay,
Wonderful.
unpause.
Unpause. Okay. So the theory here is that many cultures have a story about three prey and a predator, right? There's the three hens and the fox. There's the three pigs and the wolf. The one most of us globally are familiar with is the three little pigs, which is why I feel like it was brilliant for him to walk people through this. I also want to mention that this is a book. So I'm going to leave Cynthia with the name of this book so that any of you can buy it and read this in much more detail. But the story goes like this. I'm going to just tell the story of the three little pigs first so that you can get a hold of the actual beats of the story. And then I'm going to walk you through that as a shadow integration process. So the three little pigs. There's a mother pig, and she lives in her house with her three little piglets that she loves really dearly. They live in a place that's enclosed by a fence. And she tells the pigs, you can't go over the fence through the fence or to the other side, because if you do, the wolf might get you. And so the first little pig knows that he's not going to go talk to the wolf at all. He believes mother pig wholeheartedly and just does his thing. The second little pig tells everybody he can about how bad the wolf is because mother pig said so and is actively defending himself against the pig. The third little pig is kind of curious about the wolf and goes over to the fence every once in a while and starts to talk to the wolf. One day it's time for the little pigs to grow up. So the three little pigs kiss their mother goodbye and go out on the world on their journey. And each little pig meets a man on the road. And the first pig says, hey man, can you give me some straw so I can build my house? So the man gives the little pig some straw, and the little pig builds his house. The second pig, the one who was defending himself against the wolf, says, hey man, can you give me some sticks so I can build my house? The man gives him some sticks. The second pig builds his house. The third pig says, hey man, can you give me some bricks so that I can build my house? And the third little pig builds his house out of bricks. So the wolf comes along. The first little pig has no experience or exposure to the wolf whatsoever, because he never thought about engaging him because Mother Pig told him not to. So when the wolf says, little pig, let me in, and he says, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, and the wolf huffs and he puffs and he blows the little pig's house down, it's very easy. And the wolf eats the pig. Second little pig, the wolf says, little pig, let me in. And he says, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. This is kind of the sass version of the three little pigs. And the wolf huffs and he blows his house down. But it's harder. Sticks are harder to blow down than straw. So it took some effort for the wolf to get that pig, but he got him. The third pig, little pig, let me in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. And the wolf huffs and he puffs and he blows his house down. No, he doesn't. Sorry. He huffs and he puffs and the house does not fall down, right? But then the pig is like, I'm stuck in here. Like, I need food. I need entertainment. What's going to happen if I'm just up in this house all the time? I'm safe from the wolf, but I don't get anything of the world. So the pig is sitting there thinking about this when the wolf realizes he's got to get smarter if he wants to eat this pig. So he says, hey, little pig, I know where there's a turnip patch. Would you like to come out to the turnip patch with me and get some turnips? And the little pig says, yeah, what time are you going? And the wolf says 7. And the pig says, all right, I'll be there at 7 and I'll meet you there. So the next morning, the pig leaves his house at 6 o'clock in the morning, gets to the turnip patch, grabs some turnips, and gets back to his house before the wolf arrives. And the wolf arrives at 7 and the pig isn't there. And he goes to his house and he says, hey, I invited you to the turnip patch. You said you'd show up and you weren't there. And the pig says, oh, I'm sorry. I ended up leaving my house a little bit earlier and I got some turnips. And the wolf says, uh-huh. All right. I see you. How about that apple orchard though? You ain't got no apples. You want some apples? How about we meet at the apple orchard tomorrow? And the pig says, okay, what time are you going? And the wolf says, 8 o'clock. And the pig says, great, I'll meet you there at 8. So the pig leaves his house at 7 in the next morning to go to the apple orchard and tries to do the same thing. But this time the wolf was hip to his game. So at about 7:15, the wolf is coming up the hill and he stops at the bottom of the tree and looks up at the little pig and says, hey, how you doing? And the pig says, oh, hi, what are you doing here? And the wolf says, oh, I just happened to be out early like you were yesterday. Figured I'd come a little bit early. Here you are. How about that? And the pig says, yeah. So he has to be quick on his feet. And he grabs an apple and he says, don't these apples look really juicy? Go fetch. And he throws the apple and the wolf goes running after it. And right when the wolf goes running after it, the little pig scrambles down the ladder and goes back into his house and shuts the door with his basket full of apples. Now the pig says to himself, okay, it's time for me to go out into the world without the wolf first telling me where to go. So he decides that he's going to go to the fair and just take his chances that he won't meet the wolf. And he doesn't meet the wolf and he buys a butter churn. But on his way home, he encounters the wolf, who's down the hill, standing right in front of his house, yelling, hey, little pig, how you doing? Look at that butter churn you got. Why don't you come down here and show it to me? And the little pig says, okay, gladly. And he climbs inside the butter churn and rolls down the hill inside of the butter churn, knocks the wolf to the side, rolls right into his house and slams and locks the door, puts on a big pot of soup, and is about to enjoy his dinner when the wolf is like, all right, I'm about to take off my earrings, I'm taking off my it's time. This pig is pissing me off. So the wolf is like, little pig, I'm coming for you. And the wolf climbs on top of his house and slides down the chimney, and the pig is screaming. But underneath the chimney, inside the fireplace, what's cooking is his boiling pot of soup. So the wolf ends up sliding down the chimney right into the pot of soup. The pig quickly closes the lid. The wolf gets boiled into the soup, and the pig that night enjoys himself some wolf soup and eats the wolf. And that is the story. That's the full story of the Three Little Pigs. So I would love to, before I actually explain that as a shadow integration exercise, I would love to hear what part of the story was most interesting for you, or you're reflecting on and you're most curious about when it comes to what does that mean in terms of shadow?
Anyone?
Hi, I'm Emily. I think I was most intrigued by their reactions to their mother's advice. The three different ways of like approaching the situation. Yeah.
Yep. What else?
Other reflection? Any from there?
It's okay if there are none. I just wanted to check and see.
Hi, I'm Yanti. I found it really funny that he knew that the fox was gonna go and run after the apple. I mean, like, how did he know that?
Play fetch.
It's like,
Yeah. That's great. One more before I move in.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi. Yeah, I can see you.
Thing from the story because I was translating as well. But the one I find interesting is how the pig is always breaking divisions over division to escape, and then at the end, the division becomes like his dinner.
Okay, I didn't quite hear that one. I think you were too far away. Can someone up front say that again?
Objective for
I was saying that how the pig was creating a lot of diversion just to distract the wolf or trying to think ahead, and then finally at the end the wolf becomes his, instead of him becoming the next one, he gets it.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Let's go in. How does this really work? Okay. So all of that is a metaphor for a process that happens inside of us. Mother pigs, in this instance, are our belief system. Things that we think are absolute truths that are actually beliefs. And I was holding one of those around when I was at my job where I was falling apart and cracking, right? I had a mother pig about fame and money and the grabbing of power, that it's bad. A certain amount of fame is bad. A certain amount of power is utterly corrosive. It is not okay to have command over a lot of resources and money. Those were all mother pigs that I had. I was coming out of the social justice movement where there was a lot of talk about screw billionaires and like all of this stuff. So I had some deep mother pigs around money that I just thought were absolute truth. And there was the first part, that first pig in me. First pig is you just take it whole and you don't question it at all. So when I was in my social justice part of my career at the grassroots nonprofit, I was in total first pig around all of those mother pig beliefs around money and power and fame. Then when I became that nonprofit executive director, whoa, it was actually the swivel between. I was in first pig, but then as a nonprofit executive director, I also felt like I needed to defend that position. I would see other people with too much power, too much money, too much fame, and I would lash out against that. You shouldn't have that. You're a part of the capitalist machine. You're hurting your own people by trying to get all this money and get all this power. And that was me in second pig, trying to defend this mother pig belief. And then finally, there was third pig, where I became the nonprofit executive director of a large nonprofit, where it actually wasn't appropriate for me anymore to believe that too much money, too much power, too much fame was bad, because I needed to be on national television. I needed to be raising millions of dollars. I was playing at a completely different level than I had ever played before. And the mother pigs that I was working with were now inappropriate. So I needed to start engaging the wolf. And the wolf in this case is money and power and fame. The third pig part of me started to talk over the fence to money and power and fame. Maybe you're not all bad. Maybe I can kind of hide from this mother pig a little bit and start to walk the path of integrating you and consuming you. The turnip patch is the first time you decide to use one of the wolf's tricks against them. The first time you start to take on something from the wolf, right? And start to experiment a little bit. And in my case, it was the first time that I found myself on national television. I invoked a part of myself that I had never seen before. And it was terrifying because I realized how much I had always been a public speaker and I had always been pretty comfortable in big spotlight things, but that was just a completely different level of the game. And I tried myself out in the turnip patch and it was a little consuming. It was a lot consuming. And that's a part of the danger of walking a shadow integration process, is at any point, once you leave third pig and you start to engage the wolf, you could get consumed. You could show up at the turnip patch late and the wolf eats you and you don't integrate the shadow. You could show up at the apple orchard and not throw the apple back and get consumed by the wolf. So let's get there. So the second part of experimenting is the apple orchard. And that is where you take on some of the things of the wolf, get more and more power in my case, more and more money. And that was where my breakdown happened, was at the apple orchard. I started experimenting at the turnip patch and started trying to dabble a little bit at money and fame. And I liked it too much. And I got too consumed. And I lost track of everything else in my life and started to crack. So instead of throwing the apple back at the apple orchard, I just kept eating the apples myself, and the wolf climbed up the ladder and it consumed me. And a part of the work that I did with my coach was at the apple orchard stage. There's some things you're going to need to throw back. The apple orchard is the first place where you start to do some deep, deep discernment. What of power and money and fame am I going to keep? I'll keep this opportunity. What opportunity am I going to throw back? Because it's actually not good for the people that I'm trying to advocate for. Okay, this opportunity I'm going to take. This I can do. That opportunity is rotten. I got to throw that one back. So the apple orchard is where you start to really play in deep discernment with whatever shadow behaviors or shadow archetype you're trying to take on, right? And for me, that was where I started my own business, Soil and Shadow, and I really started to discern which opportunities were ripe and good to keep and which opportunities were rotten that I needed to throw back. Then there's the fair. And for me, the fair has been the last 8 years of my life running this company. And the fair is really where you kind of take a little bit of a break from all of that taking on of the shadow, and you just go away for a little bit and you feel what you've become. You just feel what you've become, and you just be for a little while. And it's not direct engagement with the wolf. It's a little bit of a break. But then you have to go back and see what you're made of now that you've had a chance to do some of that discernment. And that's where the butter churn comes in. And I love the butter churn as a metaphor because it's the ultimate discerner, right? You take one substance, I think milk, and then you churn it and it becomes like cream and butter and like something else. Don't ask me about the mechanics of a butter churn because I don't know what it is. I just know as a metaphor. As a metaphor, it works, right? And so the butter churn is where it's basically the ultimate discernment. You've engaged the wolf, you've done enough experimenting with throwing apples back, and now you have ultimate discernment. So you're ready to completely take on whatever archetype or behavior you're doing. And the next time that wolf tries to come and eat you, you consume it because now you have fully integrated it. I do think that I've gone through one cycle of that at least when it comes to money, power, and fame. But I think the place that I'm honestly at with this next round of it is the butter churn. Like I've been at the fair for a very long time. And the next time I really try to do a huge media push or really get a PR firm and like really try to put myself out there, that's where I'm going to see inside my butter churn, how have I done? Am I going to get consumed again by the wolf? Or have I done enough work not to? So in summary, this way of integrating shadow is about doing safe experiments with whatever wolf behaviors or archetypes you're afraid of, so that you can take on the things that are good about it and leave the parts that are bad. It remains a shadow when you're scared of it completely and you don't engage it at all. But it's the discerning engagement with it that allows you to then consume it and take it back into yourself.
Could you give us, give me an example of, when you're talking about when you're starting to engage with the wolf, and then you're also telling us about your work experience. What exactly did that look like? Or like, was that just through more dialogue and engaging, or in what forms were, like, in reality that you were engaging with the wolf, or the shadow?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question. So the shadow in this case for me was money, power, and fame, right? And I had to start engaging with the wolf when, as a national nonprofit executive director, I had to ask for $1 million. When I was a local nonprofit executive director, I was asking for maybe $50,000 a pop. Like that was the largest sum of money I ever had to ask for. Deeply engaging the wolf around how there is such a thing about too much money meant that I was asking for $1 million, and my mother pig was telling me, this is too much money. But my job was to raise a $5 million budget. I could not think that $1 million was too much to ask for someone. That's the money shadow, right? That's a tangible example. The fame shadow is, me doing a TED Talk right after coming off of a morning national television show and feeling like I don't deserve to be here. This is like, fame is like not something someone should reach for. Why do I get to be the spokesperson for this? Someone else should be talking instead of me. Like all of that imposter syndrome stuff. That's how those mother pigs were speaking to me. But I was actively touching the wolf, or else I wouldn't have been so uncomfortable. Right? It was me directly thinking that fame was bad and then doing exactly the types of things a famous person would be doing.
So in that case, did you just acknowledge your mama pig and just act the opposite, as in like just continue on with the goal?
Well, that's where the safe experiments happen, right? Like me believing that fame is bad. No, let's do money. That's just easier. It's more linear. Me believing that there is such a thing as too much money, and then choosing a safe experiment to sit with someone and ask them for $1 million was me at the turnip patch, right? It was me starting to experiment with taking on some of the wolf's tools and acting a bit like the wolf would act. And in the Three Little Pigs story, that version of it is the pig lying. He lied to the wolf to get to the turnip patch early to come home. That's not behavior that his mother would have thought the third pig should do. But he was getting wise to the wolf and was starting to take on some of the wolf's behaviors in order to beat him. And in the engagement with the wolf, that's what you do, is you start to take on some of the characteristics of that shadow thing that you're so afraid of, to just start experimenting. How bad is this really? But the apple orchard is where the discernment happens, because you can't totally just do the shadow. Like, there's a reason you reject it. There is such a thing as too much money, too much fame, too much power. Power is actually destructive at a certain level. Too much money, when it's not shared, is actually destructive. So I couldn't just completely become like the worst version of a rich, powerful butthead. But thinking in total that money is bad is not helping anybody. Then I'm not going to raise any money for my cause. It requires discernment, right? And so that's where I have to ask for certain amounts of money. Oh, like money from this corporation, maybe I'm not going to take, because then I'm actually going to be doing things that are bad. But asking for $1 million from this person, maybe that's not so bad, because they're doing really good things in the world and it feels like a safe enough experiment to explore going down that partnership. But it requires constant engagement and constant asking. And that was the part of the story where, like, taking some opportunities, throwing back certain opportunities, taking some opportunities, throwing back certain opportunities.
So, hi, Nikki. What happens to your, what happens to your mama pigs as you continue all these experimentations?
That's an excellent question. The mother pigs change. You consume the wolf and then the actual mother pig itself changes. The mother pig story. A new belief is there, which then has a new wolf. Because this process never ends, right? I'm basically talking about the journey the ego goes through when it comes to attraction and repulsion and projection at large. But if projection doesn't exist, like, the ego doesn't exist, you know? So there's always going to be some shadow to consume. It's just the next level of it.
Does it ever get exhausting to a point where, you know, you kind of feel lost or?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
So what do you do then? You know, what do you do then when you're, you know, like, exhausted?
I mean, real talk, this is why I've been at the fair for 8 years. You know, I've managed to build myself this, like, cute little $500,000 business, but I'm not, there's a level at which I could be playing that I am in a very deep discernment conversation with myself about, because I know that if I start doing certain things when it comes to being more public, doing more high leverage activities, I'm gonna have to climb in that butter churn and really see what I'm made of. And I am very clear that with a 2-year-old and an almost 5-year-old and just what my family is working with, if I get consumed by a wolf now, it actually has consequences. You know, I had the time before I had a family to just run through shadow integration processes like mad, and I could get consumed and it would be fine, because then I would just, like, sleep for 48 hours and get right back up and go back to it. But I can't afford to tank myself by going too far now. It's just a different calculus. So I'm very careful about how I engage wolves in a way that I didn't used to be. There is one more part of my talk that I was going to share about my journey with soil, but I wanted to make sure that the shadow part you had a chance to reflect on first. So I will end with the soil part of soil and shadow. And I will say that there are many ways that I don't think the shadow integration process would have worked so well for me if soil hadn't been a central part of my life. Right after I had my breakdown in 2014, I was invited to a workshop on soil carbon sequestration. And I knew what that was, right? Like I'd worked in food systems for years, but I read it and I was like, you talking about photosynthesis? Like, what we talking about? And then I go to this workshop and I learn about some somewhat fringe parts of soil science and soil health, about the liquid carbon pathway and how nutrients are exchanged between fungi and plants at the root system, how soil is actually built when it comes to the very active role that microorganisms and bacteria play. Just things that I had heard about, but I hadn't learned deeply about, especially because part of the bigger agricultural world that I was a part of doesn't really talk about that version of soil health. And more importantly, I learned about how we could sequester all of the carbon we released in the Industrial Revolution by just changing our agricultural practices. And it would stay. It wouldn't just be top-level soil organic matter that would just cycle the carbon quickly. It would actually go deep underground and become humus and the hardened part of carbon that could stay for 100+ years. So I was learning things that were utterly freaking revolutionary for me. And especially having come out of the climate world, where there was just so much hopelessness about the carbon cycle and carbon emissions and what we were doing to the atmosphere. So I went on a bit of a crusade, like, why isn't everyone talking about this? And the early years of Soil and Shadow were very soil health heavy, literal soil, where I was doing soil health advocacy and working with a lot of ranchers and farmers and trying to get information about soil health out there. And then at some point, the shadow work came back because I started asking people, why aren't you talking about this? This is actual hope. Soil is actual hope for us. And I got various answers back, but the tone, the undertone of what I was continuously getting back from people is soil is too complex to really understand. And if I can't understand it, it can't give me hope. And I was like, huh. Okay. Soil fertility is a living system. It's a moving target. The soil scientists that know the most about this type of soil health are extraordinarily clear that they know less about soil now than they did when they were first graduate students. That the more they study it, the more of an absolute mystery it is to them. The more processes they find that cannot be replicated in a laboratory. The more they actually see how many more organisms are there that they hadn't accounted for at all. Which thus means an even fewer percentage of things they are actually observing than exist. And the more actual magical it appears when they push one thing and change one thing in the system, and this cascade effect happens, and it's consistent. They know that if they stop tilling, everything else gets better, but they don't know why. And the more I learned about soil, the more I was just flabbergasted by how beautiful it was to know that there are principles, right? The National Resource Conservation Service here in America has the top 5 soil health principles, right? So try to create as little disturbance as possible is one of them. That's the no tilling. Try to integrate animals on the land when you can. That's animal husbandry. Try to have diversity of crop. That's self-explanatory. Never have exposed soil is one of them. So always be using cover cropping. And the fifth one is, I feel like it's controversial. Oh, always have living root systems. That's not the controversial one. Animals is actually the controversial one, but always have living root systems. So always be growing something. Never just have dirt, always have soil where there's something living that's growing there. And those are context independent. So they're principles because they apply anywhere and everywhere. But the practices involved there, example, right? Never have bare soil is the principle. Cover cropping is a practice. Not everywhere can cover crop. Some people just put down mulch and let it rot, and that's completely acceptable where they are. So different practices for different ecosystems. And one of the things that I loved about that was that it taught me so much about leadership team and organizational development, which is the majority of how Soil and Shadow, my firm, uses soil now, right? Is as a metaphor, as the ultimate living system to teach all other living systems how to be. Living systems as in human systems, as in the prison industrial complex, as in government and governance systems. How do we develop principles for creating fertility in all of those systems that don't necessarily have to mimic the principles of soil health, but really revolve around this idea that managing living systems requires a level of humility, it requires a level of fortitude, and it kind of honestly requires a belief in magic. It requires you to understand that there are mysterious forces at work here that maybe in 200 years we'll understand, but we won't understand them now. And how can you just let that be? And how can you understand how corrosive it is to try to strip something like soil down into just a P and K fertilizer that you can control with a monoculture that then completely strips the soil of all of its nutrients and erodes it. We can do that same thing, and we are doing that same thing in our human living systems. So a big part of my work at Soil and Shadow is teaching teams how to build fertility, using principles of soil health to create principles of social health, and teaching folks how to bob and weave in a living system, and understanding that if you take care of the relationships, which is the soil of any system, you can then grow whatever you want. So that's a little bit about soil, but I can go down many rabbit holes there.
So you talked about shadow integration and then just now about soil. What about the kind of interplay and the weaving of the two to to a whole lot, go to a whole other level?
Yeah, it is. The way that they weave together in how we talk about our work is that for leadership team and organizational development to work, the how of how we do that is fertility and shadow. And those are governing principles for all of our work and all of our clients. We learn how to do fertility from soil. So one thing is that concretely, most of our clients work in climate change and food systems because that's the sector I come from. So they are actual practitioners of soil sometimes. But I find that they tend to be the ones that are the most underinvested when it comes to leadership team and organizational development and how to be with one another. And so they understand when I bring something like soil health principles in to a team development meeting, where it's like, hey, concretely, y'all don't know how to talk to each other. Part of your conflict is that you do not have appropriate boundaries. Let's go over here and look at cover cropping as an example of how good boundaries work. What can we learn from that when we apply that into your system? or hey, y'all aren't getting along with each other. It's because you're in conflict, because you don't know how to compost what you just experienced and turn that into new fertile soil. Let's go through a composting process with what just happened so that we can turn these negative emotions into something more productive. And sometimes we do that on land itself, because land is the ultimate carrier of our human processes. So the honest way that I don't talk about very publicly often that they weave together is through ritual. We're really doing ritual when we go into businesses and teams and organizations and take them through these processes. It's ritual processes on land. It's ritual processes using soil processes and taking humans through processes that soil does to build fertility. And ultimately, it becomes a shadow integration journey. Because one of the things, I think one of the reasons that soil inspired me so much was because of what it taught me about shadow. There's so much that happens in soil that is violent, that is aggressive, that is death, like vast, vast amounts of death and decay and rot. And without all of those things, fertile soil cannot exist. Like it's from the most decaying ecosystems that the most fertile things can happen. Requires a lot of mushrooms and fungi and mycelium and all of the things, but it happens. And that's also what I try to take into systems. Like I'm a Black woman, there's no way that I'm not going to talk about shadow. There's a way that African Americans are the shadow of America. We did not exist as a people. We like African Americans don't exist. Like we are an amalgam of all these different tribes from all these different parts of West Africa, just kind of mixed together into this people called African Americans, because we were deliberately stripped of our language and our family ties and our musical traditions and all of the things that made us who we were. And so there is no way to talk about the future of America without talking about that. And so oppression, discrimination, inclusion, those are always vital parts of the work that we do. And shadow being in the name of our firm just clarifies that for people. You ain't gonna get away with not talking about shadow when you talk about us. Did that answer your question? Was there something more specific in there that you wanted me to make sure I talked about?
Yeah, I think it, yeah, that was what I was curious about. And I'm also curious about not, talking about the shadow of, let's say, white America, and composting, and the truth really that, our ancestors, the blood of, from history, has composted over hundreds of years in the soil. And those stories are held within. And you talked about rituals. How do we presence that without, just getting consumed, by darkness?
That's right. Is that a question or is that a reflection?
It's a reflection. Could be a question.
Nope, that's what I thought. I was just holding it. Are there other reflections from others in the group or comments, questions? I think we're in our discussion time now.
Yes. Anyone? And I know Laura's with us too. Laura, if you have any reflections, please do share.
Yeah, Laura.
I was just doing some call and answer out here. Like some things you laid down, I was here on mute going, whoop, yeah, whoop. So I'm with you, I'm listening. The phrase that's really standing out to me right now is like time to process, like like this, just honoring the time it takes to process so much that all just continues to happen, right? There's no break from the things that continue to happen that require processing. And I can't think of like it's living systems. If we can't look to living systems to learn, then what do we have?
And I want to just punctuate the moment with the team here, because we've been talking about personal shadows in the storytelling and diving in yesterday. And what Nikki is talking about is collective shadow. So, you know, when you talk about, she characterized, you know, the Black people are the shadow of America. That was also very much my experience living there. You know, so that's talking about collective shadow, the shadow of a culture. When you have packed away, you know, locked up, literally in the US, in the prison industrial complex, you know, your shadow, what you don't want to see. So I think as we explore tomorrow, what have we done here in Borneo, in Sabah, in Malaysia? And of course, what Nikki was alluding to about power, fame, money, that those things are quite universal. And they are, you know, pretty shadowy, what's done in the name of power, fame, and money.
Yeah, that's a good potential segue. I did want to do a writing exercise with y'all. And so I would love if you have something to write on there with you for about 5 minutes, maybe less than that. But to...
I see everyone's got notebooks, pretty much.
Okay, great. So take a moment and feel into a shadow, like a wolf that you're working with right now, or one that you would like to engage at some point. And one way to identify that is something that you're repelled by, right? One way that we recognize when we're starting a shadow integration journey is that you're attracted to something or you're repelled by something. The attraction wolf is a whole ball of wax that we're not going to get into. But the repulsion wolf generally is more easy to identify. It's like, I will never be that. I will never do that. But there's some part of your brain that's like, but I know I hate them because I want to be them. Like, that's the wolf. Right? That's the wolf. And I would love to see if you, no, you're not going to share this with anybody, but I would love for you to do an exercise. The first question is just identify a wolf that you're working with right now, or that you would like to work with at some point. And I will give you 2 minutes, and then I'll give you another prompt. So now the next prompt that you'll have a couple of minutes with is, what part of the shadow integration journey are you feeling the most intrigued by personally? And this one, it would be cool if you could share. So it can be related to the wolf that you're currently grappling with or not, but just what part of the journey are you intrigued by? It could be Oh man, I'm intrigued by the part where you defend against the wolf because you know that you kind of need to talk to the wolf. And I can see myself being defensive like that in certain places in my life. Or it could be, gosh, just the thought of running experiments with that behavior that scares me so much is a lot, but also very intriguing. Or I don't understand the fair and what that part means. But that part's kind of interesting. So just what part of the journey of that 3 little pigs do you feel the most intrigued by? Now, you don't have to share the first one. The first one about your personal wolf, that's all you. Just keep that one close. But what parts of the shadow integration journey most intrigue you?
I got one.
Okay.
Well, as I was thinking about that, I was like, why can't we just stay at the fair? What happens if you stay at the fair? I guess I feel like there's an answer.
It's a question. I mean, I am the answer to that question, I think. If you stay at the fair and you don't ever do the final discernment, then you don't ever consume the wolf and you never truly get all of the goods, right? Like the idea is that once you consume the wolf, you become the guru. You become all of the good parts of the wolf without having to deal with the bad parts of the wolf. And so you just never finish the integration journey and you keep playing a small game with whatever that wolf is. You could stay. You won't be consumed, but you won't get the gifts either.
I like that. Also, you know, if you stay long enough, the wolf might find you at the fair.
That's also true.
Like, so I was just thinking, like, maybe, like, I don't know for other people, but like in my situation, like in my life, I feel like I'm still in the comfort of that mother pig. Like you can be like the tree, the number 1, 2, or 3, but like you're not going out from your house yet to build that house. You're not even selecting your materials. So that's, I don't know, like how do you step out, like grow up maybe.
That is so real. It's so real. But the pig's house is comfortable. Why would I go out there? I feel you. It's dangerous out there. It actually is dangerous. You could actually get eaten by the wolf. You keep doing this journey until you don't, but lots of times you step out and you get eaten. It's a very valid question. And you know, you don't grow, but you stay safe, which is what a lot of people do.
Why wouldn't the wolf want to collaborate with the pigs to just look for food together? Why does it have to pick the pig?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if that's how those things worked? I know. You know, it's what the thing that I think is so brilliant about that question is there is a thing in the communities I come from where actual fighting and opposition is kind of a bad word, right? There are certain social justice communities, especially, that are like all collaboration all the time, all consensus decision-making all the time. Hierarchies are all bad, which are mother pigs themselves, right? But one of the reasons that I really appreciate both soil and the spiritual perspective that I've gotten from this yogic practice is that the ego doesn't work like that. The ego is in a process of consuming and becoming. in its evolutionary state. And the ego fights hard to protect itself. The battles that happen inside of us are, they can look quite violent sometimes. And it's important to have tools that can match that.
Nikki, is that why the third little piggy didn't tell their other siblings to build a brick house?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Hmm.
You know, my understanding of that story is that those three pigs represent different versions of ourselves that actually don't talk to each other. One becomes the other in a way. So in this story, they were separate parts, but they actually represent evolutionary steps. So like first pig becomes second pig, becomes third pig. But at any point you could get stuck at any one of them. So that's why in this story, they were kind of pulled out and became different archetypes. Some of the psychology behind this shadow integration process is that the shadow is pieces of ourselves that we have disowned because it's too uncomfortable for us to claim them as ourselves, right? And so, hey, we only resist it because we know it's a part of us, but it's uncomfortable for us. So we have to put it out there on another person because that's the only way that we're able to see it, because it's just too uncomfortable to say it's us. So this shadow integration process is a journey of reclaiming that thing that we've put on the other person out there as us. I would like to be famous and very wealthy. That's me. So I hated wealthy people who were famous. You know, like I was deeply attracted to it and I was repelled by it, and it just made me hell of uncomfortable. So it's a beautiful thing, I think, when we're attracted to things that seem really different from us, because it means we're finally ready to accept that it's actually a part of ourselves that we need to get back.
Like, for example, how we all have to struggle with Donald Trump.
Woo! You just go into like the ultimate wolf, just like 0 to let's just get the actual like granddaddy wolf and bring him up in this piece. Okay, I see you.
Is there a part of you that wants to be Donald Trump?
I can see the benefits of being Donald Trump. I could roll with it. I would do it differently, but I could roll with his power and money.
Well, see, and I think that's such a fascinating example, because going through that process of like what parts of what he's doing, I think about this all the time. What parts of what he's doing are actual apple opportunities that need to be kept instead of rotten parts that need to be thrown away? I think most of us can understand the rotten parts that need to be thrown away. But he wouldn't be as popular as he is if there weren't some actual gems in what he's doing. And it's been quite the process for me to do some discernment around that.
So just Nikki said something that sometimes is termed as projection. So, you know, something that's your shadow in the bag of your shadow, you project onto others. Yeah, so that's another, I guess, psychological term. Maybe you can look it up. But projection. So oftentimes we also project our shadow feelings or experiences or characteristics. Because that's the shadow trend.
I think
Go ahead.
I just struggle with, like, this dude has this completely radical religious ideas that I don't agree with. And I don't see myself ever integrating that because I just don't know how to. It's just complete opposite of my world. So how do you reconcile that? How do you integrate the shadow?
Well, I'm going to tell you a little personal story. I was dancing, like literally dancing with this guy who was polyamorous. And I was like, no way, just no way, not gonna go anywhere. And then I told myself, well, why not? He's so hot. and I knew it was my own, my own belief system that was saying wrong. And I said, I'm just going to allow myself to go there. And I did. And it was a powerful, very freeing exercise, relationship practice. And I it was somewhat, dancing with the wolf. It was ultimately so empowering to me as a woman, as a human. Not telling you like you gotta go hang out with this dude, but just saying, that there is an allowing and a self and a permission to self. I think that is.
Yeah, that's so good, Cynthia. That's so good. Oh, we could spend this whole time talking about them attraction wolves.
Yes.
Okay, but I would also say one of the answers to that question for me though is that it would not have my attention if there wasn't something there for me. That's usually where I start. There are lots of things that I'm sure I don't like, but it's just a passing thought. Like, oh, I don't like that person, and I never think about them again. Or, oh, I don't like that thing. And then it doesn't ever come up again unless it's right in front of me. But if I find myself strongly against that thing, if I find myself thinking about it when they're not in front of me, something in my mind and in my body is putting energy and attention over there. And if that's happening, that means that there is something in there for me. So usually the first step that I take is I write down the strongest things that I dislike about that person. I just write them all down. The way that they talk attracts people to them, and they're talking absolute bullshit. The way that they think makes me think that they are actually destructive. Like I just write down all of the things, right? And the next step is seeing if some of their behaviors, if I actually did those things, would help me achieve what I want in the world. That's also usually where I go. But I think that's because a lot of my wolves are related to power, money, and fame. We'd have to go a little bit deeper when it comes to the religious aspect of things. But that's usually where I start. And I would say that because I know my time's kind of up, the book is called Pigs Eat Wolves, Going into Partnership with Your Dark Side by Charles Bates. I highly recommend it. And if you are in the, I want to actually work on this in real life spirit, there is a course, an online course that takes you through the Pigs Eat Wolves process that has workbook materials and all this stuff. And it was done by his widow, who's my coach, and it's a brilliant course and I highly recommend it. So I'll give Cynthia the links to both of those and she can give those to y'all.
Thank you, Nikki. Lots of note taking here. I think they were going to ask you that question, but you preempted the question. So I think we're at close.
I think I've got one more thing.
Oh, okay. Kimberly has one.
Yeah. So just like maybe some quick notes on this is unrelated to the shadow, but like how we can concretely take steps to improve soil, as you have described, like personal mini action steps.
What kind of
think that's
soil we talking
another-
about? Like large pieces of land, garden-sized soil? What are we talking about?
Like large area or small? Right, yeah, anything I think, because I'm just wondering like what I can do about it. In relation to like soil.
Yeah, that's a big question.
That is another 1.5 hour session, I think.
Well, what I will say, one of the reasons it's a big question is because there's a big debate in the soil health world about whether individuals can do very much, or whether it actually has to be on a large scale if you really want to sequester carbon, right? I am of the opinion that anytime you can increase the microbiome of soil, you are doing a good thing and spreading the health and wealth of where you are. So step one would be to leave it alone. Whatever it is, stop doing whatever you do. And then the second step would be to do this thing where you try to keep the soil covered, try to always have living roots, and try not to till or disturb the soil, right? And so if it's a bare piece of land, plant things that you know that you're not going to try to harvest and pull up or roll into the soil. If you're planting things and they're really spaced out far apart, cover whatever it is in between those plants with mulch or something like that so that no soil is exposed, and then leave it alone for a while and see what happens. Those are some like super basic principles, but then also if you can bring animals in there, any kind of animals that interact with soil, that would be really good. And you'll start to see pollinators and like all kinds of stuff come back.
Okay, thank you.
You can also ask Junior over here, soil scientist.
Oh.
Hey.
Okay, everyone. Nikki has to go look after a couple of small ones, and we are gonna spend some time in juicy discussion, peeling the layers of what you've just shared with us. Thank you so much. Everyone, let's show some love. Thank you.